Freaky, previously titled more aptly as Freaky Friday the 13th, is a 2020 transgender predicament horror comedy riffing on Freaky Friday with a slasher film twist centering on a Michael Myers-esque serial killer, the Blissfield Butcher, played by Vince Vaughn, switching bodies with one of his female victims, Millie Kessler, played by Katherine Newton. Hilarity ensues as a fish-out-of-water girl in a man's body tries to stop a male mass murderer in a girl's body while being hunted by police. The film explores gender, empathy across the gender line, and the forms of power attainable by men and women in a way both intriguing to feminists and accessible to a mainstream audience. It was released on Friday the 13th of November, 2020, during the pandemic, but pretty much evaded the public consciousness until it was released on VOD, Video on Demand, in early December. It is amazingly progressive, featuring modern trans-inclusive feminist politics, immense respect given across the gender line, a startling minimization of transphobia and misogyny, and in-your-face queer content, brought to you by gay director Christopher Landon and gay co-writer Michael Kennedy. Landon previously made the 2017 Groundhog Day slasher film Happy Death Day and its 2019 sequel, Happy Death Day to You, and he aspires to make a Happy Death Day freaky crossover film sequel. Not quite sure how that will work. Freaky is my new favorite film of all time, beating out transgender horror drama Let the Right One In. However, it is not great on race, having some cringy racist dialogue, and a colonialistic fear of natives, albeit a particularly brutal native culture, the Aztecs, as the inspiration for the plot device that causes the body swap. It's not perfect, but its strong points really shine. The genre is not horror comedy in the sense of being a spoof of the horror genre, like Scary Movie. Rather, it is a real horror film with comedic elements, and homages to popular horror films like Halloween, Friday the 13th, The Shining, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and others, both honoring and parodying these moments. The more horror films you've seen, the more you'll appreciate the nuances, but it's not an elitist collection of references like Ernest Cline's Ready Player One. At the end of the day, it works just as well as a standalone piece. The plot starts in a manner similar to the 1996 film Scream, featuring a teaser of how the killer operates, so that when he later shows up to threaten the protagonist, we have a sense of the danger that she faces. On Wednesday the 11th, 4 rich teenage douchebags have a sexy private party at a mansion. One recounts the urban legend of the Blissfield Butcher, a mass murderer who kills the teens of Blissfield around homecoming. The accuracy of the legend is immediately put into question. He supposedly committed his first massacre in 1977, but Vince Vaughn would have been 7 years old at the time. Another claims that he committed his only massacre in the 90s, which lines up better, but it's all vague and uncertain. The most we can get out of the legend is that he kills people sporadically enough that people can fear him in general, while still dismissing him as a realistic threat. It leaves room to develop the character in a possible sequel involving time travel in a Groundhog Day loop.
Really?
Don't underestimate a straight white man's propensity for violence, Isaac.
This is the only explanation the movie offers, and it holds up well enough. In recent years, there's been attention given to the American phenomenon of school shootings and similar massacres through a social lens, focusing on socialized straight white male entitlement instead of blaming bullying on its own or the influence of violent media. This is politically on point, and it's socially responsible for a horror media item to not lend credence to censorship of the horror genre, Stein. This is a similarity with Scream.
Don't you blame the movies! Movies don't create psychos! Movies make psychos more creative!
The legend notes that the Butcher specifically targets teens engaged in debauchery, drinking and having sex. Certainly these kids are, and the Butcher targets them, but it's later implied that he does so opportunistically, because they're vulnerable without adults present. This alludes to the pervasive criticism of slasher films having perceived puritanical morality, where underage drinking and sex are narratively punished, and only a final girl, who is a virgin, is allowed to live. This was never an intentional subtext of slasher films. Black Christmas and Friday the 13th featured sex-punishing villains as a means of including progressive subtext, while Halloween innocently featured victims engaging in debauchery, because what the hell else are teenagers gonna do when alone? But it is perhaps a problematic commonality of the genre in general that horror films have tried to address as early as Scream.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex.
Freaky pays homage to the trope in a style reminiscent of Halloween, and then drops it past the opening scene. The mansion is filled with stolen artifacts from native cultures, including masks and weapons. To a degree, I think this is social commentary on rich white douchebaggery, but the film also engages in colonialistic exotification of the Aztec culture. Curly-headed douchebag rummages through the artifacts and pulls out La Dola, an evil Aztec knife identifiable as evil because it has a skull on the hilt. Spooky. To a degree, it's social commentary that some rich white douchebag acquired this knife as a decoration without really understanding its significance in a foreign culture. But it's also an artifact of evil magic, disrespecting the Aztec culture that the film assigns it to.
Do you like my mask? Isn't it pretty? It raises the dead. Americans.
The butcher borrows one of the masks, giving him a Jason look. Curly-headed douchebag goes looking for wine, and the butcher kills him by shoving a bottle down his throat and smashing it, reminiscent of Friday the 13th wacky murders. He then kills his date by smashing her head with a toilet seat, showcasing his ability to adapt on the fly. As for the other two douchebags, they have sex, and, in a twist on gender stereotypes, the girl comes before the guy and leaves him unsatisfied.
You know, that's really inconsiderate.
Yeah, because guys are always so considerate.
I mean, unless they negotiated some tease and denial fantasy, have to side with the guy there. Interesting twist on stereotypes, though. The butcher kills him with a tennis racket by snapping the handle off and sticking the halves in the guy's head. Yeah, it's so ridiculous that you kinda have to laugh at it. The film handles the interplay of horror and comedy really well. This bit has the great pacing of the girl freaking out because her date was killed, pausing to think about it, and then screaming because she's in danger.
Oh my god, Warren. Oh my god. Me.
She almost gets away because she's smart enough to hide in a secret compartment, but she doesn't wait there and gets killed. The butcher examines his work in a Michael Myers headcock, and then hears La Dola calling out to him. He steals the knife and vanishes into the night, leaving dead teenagers for the parents to find. And then it switches to a different movie. There is a dramatic tone shift from the slasher film opening to what looks like this upbeat teen drama about mousy girl Millie dealing with the pressures of being a teen girl in high school, in the same town where a bunch of teens just got murdered the night before. It's weird, but it somehow works.
We are screwed.
Hey, I don't want to hear that defeatist attitude. I want to hear you upbeat.
We are screwed.
There you go.
Okay, so Thursday the 12th introduces Millie, a nice white girl in an upper middle class home. She takes out her retainer, kisses a poster of Brandon Urie, who is pansexual, high queer subtext, and goes to join the family for breakfast. The Kessler family is very female-centric, with single mom Coral, played by Katie Finneran, older cop sister Shar, played by Dana Drury, and Millie. The Kessler patriarch recently died, and his absence is felt. Something very cleverly illustrated in the way that they sit at the table together, making room for a fourth person who is absent, while allowing for fourth wall camera placement to get them all in the same shot. Their conversation is not necessarily a Bechdel test pass, as they mention the dead father and Millie's interest in boys, but it does have a feminine focus of feminist significance, which is a good example of how the Bechdel test can just fail as an accurate measure of a film's feminism. Coral is afraid of Millie sleeping with the guy and getting pregnant, so she's putting pressure on her to not go to the homecoming dance, and instead go to a cheap production of Wicked with her. Though there is no official gay content in Wicked, the widely perceived gay subtext between Elphaba and Glinda may be the reason for its inclusion in Freaky. Char tries to defend Millie's freedom and gets into a tense argument with Coral, while Millie uncomfortably sits and watches, completely passive while people discuss her. Char sees that Coral drank a bottle of wine the night before, and, disgustedly, throws out her breakfast and leaves for work. I think Landon and/or Kennedy did a lot of research into the psychological effects of trauma. The Butcher and each member of the Kessler family displays one of the 4F trauma personality types: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. The Butcher is fight, the purest embodiment of domination. Char is flight, neurotically vanishing into her work. Coral is freeze, drinking and zoning out. And Millie is fawn, the purest embodiment of submission. It keeps the characters realistic and orderly, while setting up the thematic twist of the world's biggest bully and the world's biggest doormat switching places. As she goes to school, Millie meets up with her best friends, black feminist girl Nyla, played by Celeste O'Connor, and outrageous white twink Josh, played by non-binary actor Misha Osherovich. Millie pauses to pet a black dachshund, held by a black neighbor, and Josh introduces himself like this.
I love your black wiener, Mr. Daniels. Joshua.
The dog is black, Nyla.
Yeah, that was just racist. I get the desire to have an outspoken gay character who deliberately makes straight people uncomfortable.
That guy's queer than the blazes. He took his clothes off. Let's get going.
But there was no need to bring race into it. He could just say something like, I love your long skinny wiener. Or he could pet the dog and say, I love stroking your wiener. You know, same concept. No need to invoke racist stereotypes.
You fuck me with your big black cock.
We're introduced to Nyla as a stereotypical annoying feminist who polices everyone's language. It's borderline anti-feminist, but is ultimately acceptable for keeping it realistic as a character trait, and not letting it become annoying to the audience, just as something for Josh to disagree with, so the characters can bounce off of each other. The framing is similar to the use of Lisa Simpson in The Simpsons Season 5, Episode 14, Lisa vs. Malibu Stacy, where she's first a bit outrageous and to be mocked, just so that she can later be used as a means of communicating a feminist message, without the plot coming off as didactic. It stays fun. As part of their disagreement, Josh alludes to trying to get straight guys drunk, and then coming on to them.
That sounds kind of rapey.
Good.
This exchange can come off simultaneously like a demonization of feminists calling out rape, and a portrayal of gay guys as rapists. But I think this is a misreading. In attempting to criticize cultural problems like bad sexual ethics, Nyla behaves in a controlling manner, and that's what Josh pushes against, not really the concept of not being a rapist. The exchange tackles the problem of how to communicate feminist morals without being didactic, by having Nyla criticize the concept while isolated as a single character in a larger scene, instead of her speaking as the voice of the narrative. While guys who might be inclined to agree with Josh, we'll see how well this goes later on, when a guy basically forces himself on Josh and then gets butchered. Overall, the plot is overtly anti-rape and pro-gay. And Nyla gives Millie advice to not neglect her own identity by trying to be what everyone else wants her to be. Which, if you think about it, is basically a trans message. Just saying. Then they trade platonic I love yous, which is a nice display of affection without entering no homo territory. She later does the same thing with Josh. There has been some criticism of Nyla as a black best friend stereotype who serves as the emotional support for a white protagonist, which is fair, but I do think there is some nuance in the depiction of her as having a life outside of supporting Millie. She's interested in feminism, clearly advances her pet causes to anyone who will listen, and will show initiative in handling the weird magical crisis that befalls them. Also, Josh says this of Millie.
You're a fucking piece, girl.
Oh, I'm a piece.
Huh?
Millie goes through her day being harassed by popular girl Ryler, played by Melissa Colazzo, a random guy who barks at her, a dickish woodshop teacher, played by Stuart from Spin City, Ellen Ruck, and a couple of jackass jocks, Brett and Phil, I think. Her Her one respite is getting to sit next to her crush, Booker, played by Uriah Shelton, who shows her sympathy when the teacher is mean to her, but is hesitant to defend her outright. In the middle of this high school drama, the news breaks that 4 teenagers were horribly murdered the night before, the killer still at large.
Oh my god, it's a slaughterhouse.
The teens are surprised and concerned, but don't really feel the emotional weight of the crime and treat it as a source of gossip. A handling that is appropriately cynical of human nature, without crossing the line into hating young people, like Scream Queens was wont to do, with its gratuitous digs at millennials. Ryler pretends to be hit hard just for attention, earning Josh's scorn.
Ginny hated Ryler after she started that rumor about Ginny getting a carrot stuck in her pussy.
Don't say that word.
Whatever. Vagina.
Is considering the word pussy sexist even a thing? I know there's been an effort to normalize speaking about lady parts, but I haven't heard don't use slang. Now, there has been an attempt to get people to stop using the word pussy as a slang word for coward, but that's because it means vagina, not because it's slang. This bit comes off as something that the writers think could plausibly be a feminist complaint, more than an actual feminist complaint. There's an abrupt cut to a football game, making me wonder if there was a deleted scene there that was cut for pacing. No one really cares about the danger afoot. Millie does a dance as the school mascot, a beaver, high gender theme, and is harassed by douchebags. Once again, Booker looks sympathetic, but doesn't do anything. Coral is late to pick Millie up. She assures her friends that she'll be okay, and sits on a bench to wait, which she does for hours, as everyone leaves. And it turns out that Coral got drunk and passed out. Char finds her and calls Millie. Millie asks her to come pick her up, but the battery dies mid-call. What a great time for the butcher to show up! Every modern slasher movie struggles with the concept of cell phones, which throws a monkey wrench into the isolating dynamics set up in the 1980s, where teens are threatened and then can't call for help or organize with other people. Even the millennium-skirting Buffy stood out as weird for not featuring cell phones, which earned a self-aware joke in its last season about how a cell phone was a powerful weapon. Your next solution was to have its tech-savvy villains use a cell phone jammer. Freaky finds a good compromise in featuring smartphones being useful throughout the film, and having the plot device of a battery running out in a way that doesn't feel contrived, as it ties into the whole Coral is neglectful thing, so that we can have this classic killer stalking an isolated girl scene where we aren't sure if Char is coming. The butcher stalks her in a way reminiscent of Michael Myers with his iconic slow advance. Millie rips the mask off of him, and we get a look at him as a person more than a faceless killer. And damn, the swingers guy can be intimidating when he wants to. He takes Ladola and, yeah. This is silly. The butcher stabs her in her left shoulder, and he instantly gains the same wound in his own shoulder, like coercive empathy. As he tries to figure out what's going on, Char shows up and scares him away by firing shots in the air. Of course, what they don't show you is the people a mile away who get killed by bullets falling from the sky. Why do gun owners never know basic gun safety in movies? Writers should research that stuff. That portrayal is just irresponsible. She's a cop, for crying out loud. She should know better.
That is going to kill somebody when it lands in Boston.
She takes the shell-shocked Millie to the police station, Coral only showing up later. The two of them have words while Millie tries to process. Give the writers credit for depicting trauma accurately, even if they are lacking in gun protocol. Millie goes to bed, tossing and turning as Ladola whispers its name in her head. And at midnight, Friday the 13th, body swap, the butcher wakes up in her body. Catherine Newton's acting is incredible, communicating a lot about this savage man, being really confused about his cushy setting, the woman acting like his mom, and new girly features, without saying a word. We also get a POV shot of a poster of Pitch Perfect 2, Millie's favorite movie. You know, the one where Becca is explicitly into Commissar.
Okay, just because you are making me very sexually confused does not mean that you are intimidating.
The butcher accepts being female now, very gracefully, all things considered. He just looks in the mirror, checks to see if the breasts are real, and moves on from there. He's intelligent, analytical, and just goes with it. I've seen criticism of this shot for focusing on a man feeling himself up, like it's sexually objectifying the female form, but I don't see any issue with how it's shot. The butcher really just assesses his new circumstances and moves on from there. It could be shot much more sexually, and it's not. And even if it were sexual, it would only be problematic if the camera focused on the body voyeuristically for the presumed straight male gaze. If it focused on the butcher's sexual experience as a character, it wouldn't be significantly different from a standard depiction of a cis man or woman experiencing a sexual act. And to say otherwise because of the transgender body swap would be transphobic. I just don't see any way around that. The butcher wanders into the kitchen, where Coral is fixing breakfast. He immediately notices the sharp knives that he can use to kill people, but can't make use of them because Coral, without even noticing his aggression, pushes him into Millie's chair, easily overpowering his weak girl body. Well, that's rude. He clearly didn't want to sit down. He just kind of goes along with it, presumably out of confusion and recognizing that he can't get his way through his normal bullying behavior. It's also possible that Millie's body has some influence on his personality. If this is true, it's not telegraphed well at all, but there is some dialogue at the end that might suggest it because he seems to understand more about her than what he personally experiences. But he may also just be highly intelligent and make a few intuitive leaps. It's not really clear. In any case, he makes use of the breakfast that Coral prepares for him in his unrefined way, then tries to kill Char when she shows up. But Coral just takes the knife out of his hand, never even noticing his aggressive stance. He just stands there baffled, not in any danger, but unable to do what he likes. Coral references Millie's friends at school.
Friends. Then he got an idea. An awful idea.
Meanwhile, Millie wakes up in the butcher's body, in the middle of a scary murder shack, later clarified to be the old mill. Millie freaks out and, unlike the butcher, speaks. A homeless guy bothers her for drugs, and she asks what he sees when he looks at her, verifying her circumstances through seeking another's perspective, instead of simply quietly analyzing like the butcher. Of course, he now thinks that she's high and begs for some of her supply.
I want to feel like a teenage girl. I want to feel like a girl.
It's funny, and it also functions as transgender thematic subtext about as much as The Matrix.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole.
Creeped out, Millie runs.
I'll suck your dick!
And that, although transactional, functions as thematic queerness. Millie tries to talk to familiar neighbors, but everyone recognizes the butcher from the sketch, and she has to run from everyone, not to mention the cops. Eventually, she realizes that that body stinks, and sneaks into the school to take a shower. Narratively speaking, Millie in the butcher's body is functionally a trans woman, displaying dysphoria from being forced to occupy a male body that is not hers. It is emphasized that she is female in spite of her body, having a female gender identity, and female she/her pronouns are enforced in text. This is trans-positive subject matter communicated to the viewer intuitively through framing. Likewise, the butcher more or less takes the role of a trans man in her body, is understood to be male, and has male he/him pronouns enforced in text.
What about her?
Pronouns.
Christ, what about him?
However, while Millie is overtly dysphoric, the butcher adapts really well to having a female body, to the extent that I wonder if he might be subtextually gender fluid. A non-binary gender identity, where one can shift between identifying as male or female or other. Having a chance to dress himself, he rejects Millie's nerdy clothes, and instead of looking for butch clothing to build a masculine aesthetic, he digs through Char's wardrobe and builds a hot femme bad girl aesthetic that I'm pretty sure is an allusion to the Terminatrix of Terminator 3. The Terminatrix also transforms into a man at one point. Just saying. He shows up at school with a confident swagger, a predator ready to strike. And this makes him look really hot as a woman. All the street boys are into him, and he doesn't seem to mind at all. Yeah, I think he's gender fluid and maybe also bisexual. In Incidentally, the shot is an homage to Jennifer's body, which of course is an homage to Ginger Snaps. Possible gender-fluid subtext aside, it may be problematic that the mainstream audience does not get to see an effective trans man character. In adopting the baby Terminatrix look, as opposed to the masculinity of trans man Brendan Tina of Boys Don't Cry, or the androgyny of non-binary Stevani in Steven Universe, it appears to suggest a biological essentialism where the character becomes female in that form because lady parts equal female. Even with Millie running around in the male body, experiencing dysphoria, and trying to make her voice sound right, it's not hard to confuse cishets. They either should have made the butcher more masculine, or included some clarifying dialogue. Otherwise, it just looks a bit transphobic.
Does she look cute?
Interestingly, he doesn't immediately try to kill anyone. He just enjoys going to school as a hot girl. Which is kind of a trans girl fantasy. Just saying. Even when Josh, Nyla, and Ryler annoy him by talking to him, he isn't murderous until Ryler specifically antagonizes him by continuing to badger him for gossip material and insulting the butcher's features from the sketch that she saw. The butcher tries to figure out how best to kill Ryler, finding random objects that are either too flimsy or too heavy for that body. He then strokes her hair, giving her the impression that Millie is a lesbian. It would appear to be accurate that the butcher is into her, but he's more sexually sadistic and, evil than interested in romance. She goes for a potty break to blab to her friends about Millie being gay, while the butcher figures out his next course of action. She catches sight of Millie showering in the girls' locker room and freaks out because she recognizes that body as the butcher. Aside from whatever amusement is offered through Vince Vaughn showering like a girl, there is a noticeable lack of transphobia. It would have been easy to depict her as horrified over a man being nude in a girl's locker room, assuming male sexual deviance as is associated with queerness as representing a threat of rape and or murder, as is seen in Psycho and Mrs. Doubtfire.
Come on, we gotta call the cops. We gotta dial 911 now.
Why?
Well, Mrs. Doubtfire, he's a she.
Instead, the unusual gender behavior is presented completely neutrally, and it's all about a known serial killer being spotted on campus. Ryler goes to the butcher for help, and he tells her to hide in the cryotherapy chamber, which he turns into a murder weapon like in Scream Queens. Yeah. I looked it up, and it seems completely implausible that anyone would actually die in one if there wasn't some damage to the unit, let alone freeze into a T-1000 popsicle. But at least they actually commit to her dying.
I've never felt better.
Millie discovers the corpsicle and realizes that the butcher is on the loose, so she goes to her two best friends for help. This goes as well as you would expect.
You're black! I'm gay! We are so dead!
Yeah, black and gay people don't have the best luck in horror films. In the case of black people, it's largely a matter of who the story centers around, with some racism and the assumption that stories centered on black people won't sell. And it follows that black actors are mostly given minor roles that are quickly killed off. In the case of gay people, it's more sinister, with the Hays Code having actively been homophobic and instilling Hollywood with stereotypes depicting gay people as evil or tragic. And now it's hard to break away from these formulas. In the horror genre especially, there's a certain toxic masculine undercurrent that seeks to punish queerness. With this self-aware joke, the film asserts an intent to do better than that. Josh and Nyla subvert their victim stereotypes by fighting for their lives. Millie has to fight just to talk to them, as might be an allusion to the fight scene in They Live. Eventually, they tire out, and Millie performs her mascot dance. It's funny seeing Vince Vaughn act like a girl, but I think that the framing is fundamentally respectful. Josh and Nyla ask some personal questions, and finally confirm her identity.
TV show?
Sabrina.
While millennials might assume that she means Sabrina the Teenage Witch from the 90s, it's more likely that she means the modern Chilling Adventures of Sabrina on Netflix, which is a very queer-positive show with plenty of pansexual gay love, and there is a transgender character played by a non-binary actor. Just saying. They relocate to the boys' room so Millie can empty her man-sized bladder. They all thematically subvert rigid gender expectations. Millie most dramatically in her body swap, and then Josh acts really gay again, and Nyla fixes her makeup, a feminine activity, while casually hanging out in the boys' room.
She's got a dick in her hand and you're wearing Chanel No. 5. Think we're past labels.
Millie remembers Ladola. Josh looks it up and finds an image of it with a Spanish inscription. Yes, the Aztec language. As a Blumhouse film, it's possible that this is a spoof of the 2016 film The Darkness, which features a woman casting out Native American spirits while speaking Spanish. Producer Jason Blum could be poking fun at himself with Ladola. They go to the Spanish teacher for a translation, poking fun at the trope of the knowledgeable source of exposition. She explains that the body swap will be permanent after 24 hours, completely convinced that the knife is magically evil, that a body swap has occurred, and that she's giving this grave pronouncement, while utterly unmotivated to do anything about it. She gives exposition and then vanishes from the plot. While Nyla and Josh learn about Ladola, Millie gets a chance to get revenge on the random barking boy when he comes into the restroom. Using her body's strength and intimidation factor, she dabbles in traditionally masculine dominance and scares him into promising not to be a bully anymore.
If you ever mess with Millie Kessler or any other kid again...
And there we see the difference between her and the Butcher. Even when living out a power fantasy, she still cares about other people. The Butcher only cares about himself, and maybe Millie a little, but only now as an aspect of himself. The Butcher goes to woodshop class as Millie, and seems like he might be attracted to Booker. When Booker cuts his finger, the Butcher sucks it while looking turned on. Another nod to the Terminatrix. The woodshop teacher is mean to him, so he wanders back after class and tries to kill him. The teacher fights him into submission twice, but the Butcher figures out that if he tricks the teacher into lowering his guard by pretending to give up, and then strikes more exactly, he can overpower a man larger and stronger than him. The teacher gets table sawed. The fact that he specifically kills bullies does a lot to keep his murder spree entertaining. If he did kill Nyla and Josh, as he threatened to do in the kitchen, we wouldn't like him nearly as much. I speculate that this has something to do with his psychology, like maybe he was bullied in high school, and that's specifically what sets him off. The fact that he seems to demonstrate trauma symptoms along with the Kessler family may indicate a traumatic bullying experience. This would be in theme with the alluded to phenomenon of school shooters, motivated by bullying, but ultimately bullies themselves, with straight white male entitlement. Leaving the scene of the crime, he discovers one advantage to his body. Cops don't try to arrest him anymore.
Fuck off, piggies.
Millie and friends then run into him. They eye each other for a moment. He assesses the situation and decides to keep that body, using his presumed innocence as a girl to play the victim and call the cops back. They then chase after Millie, while Nyla and Josh help her escape. Shar hears about it on the police radio and gives chase.
Suspect spotted with 2 youths, teenagers, 1 black female, 1 white. Excited.
Oh hi, thematic androgyny. They duck into a department store that happens to be where Coral works, and park Millie in a changing room while the others look for a disguise. Coral shows up, and Millie pretends to be a customer trying on polo shirts. Everything is pink here, and I thought at first that this was the women's changing rooms, and it was a setup to a whoops, I forgot which body I'm in kind of gag, but it turns out to just be unisex, contributing to that thematic androgyny. Coral rambles a story about getting a polo shirt for her late husband, which also involves subverting gender roles because he was initially upset at being given a pink polo shirt, but came to love it.
Oh, a new shirt! What a pretty color!
Through her role as a random male customer, Millie is able to connect with her mother in a way that she can't otherwise, and gives her advice on dealing with her youngest daughter that communicates what Millie can't say directly. It's very sweet. Shar comes in and pulls Coral away, and Nyla and Josh return with a mask for Millie. It's of a quarterback, but it has the look of a Michael Myers mask, and there's some fun physical comedy because she can't see in it. It effectively pokes fun at Halloween, while working as its own thing. Josh goes on Instagram and tracks down the Butcher, who's hanging out with, / stalking, the jocks at a haunted house-themed mini-golf place. The school had canceled homecoming dance due to the killings, but the butcher encourages the jocks to throw their own at the old mill to be his hunting grounds. One of the jackass jocks gropes him, and the butcher says this.
Your touch makes this pussy drier than sandpaper, you fucking monkey.
The teen girl sitting behind me at the movie theater really liked that line. That butcher, standing up for teen girls everywhere. What an inspiration. The butcher flirts with Booker and leads him into the mini golf course to stalk. Millie and Josh also enter the course. Then there are some cheap jump scares exactly where it makes sense to have them in a haunted house. Millie saves Booker from the butcher in an androgynous twist on the damsel in distress dynamic. Booker flees.
Don't let him get away! He'll call the cops!
Landon's orchestration of tension is masterful. The scene fluidly heightens from quiet stalking to a quick fight to an edge-of-your-seat chase. During this, Millie figures out that she can use the butcher's physical strength to jump through a trellis instead of going around it. Literally smashing through a wall is a nice visual metaphor for transgressing the rules of society, as the butcher does as a murderer, and as we might also associate with rigid gender roles. The body swap butcher later does the same thing with a tool and a weakened old mill wall. They bring the butcher and a knocked-out Booker to Josh's place because a single mom is on a business trip, and they firmly tie the butcher to a chair. When Booker wakes up, Millie tries to convince him that she's Millie, while the butcher pretends to be Millie, and tries to emotionally manipulate him, effectively adapting to the form of power at his disposal. Booker starts to run, and Millie puts her heart on the line by reciting a love poem that she slipped in his locker weeks ago. I like to watch the butcher during this part. He has this great WTF expression. Booker is convinced. His mind is blown, but he can recognize the girl he likes in this manly face. And, as Millie's femininity is asserted, so too is the butcher's masculinity.
You sad fucking cunt. Poem.
This is the rare use of the C word that I find unobjectionable, because it's about defining the butcher as an aggressive, abusive man, to contrast with Millie as a kind, gentle girl. It's a return to firm gender roles in their specific gender identities, while in dramatically transgressive bodies. It asserts the validity of their gender identities, just as Booker is introduced to these wacky circumstances. It's a far cry from, say, The Boys on Amazon, using it almost every episode to show how mean, while also lovable, is their deuteragonist. Butcher.
That ain't the invisible cunt.
Nyla gags him.
I just had my own sock duct taped into my mouth last night.
Well, what?
Yeah, shoved into my mouth, and then was duct taped over it.
Far from being disempowered, though, he just adapts to minimalistic communication, having a strong presence even though he can only communicate through glares, grunts, emotionally manipulative whimpers, and mean laughs. It certainly helps that he didn't talk much before. He was already highly expressive through body language alone.
What about her?
Pronouns.
Christ, what about him?
Nyla asserts that the butcher is only to be discussed with he-him pronouns. Booker is annoyed at her word policing, but the scene must move forward, so he just accepts this gender identity schema, and the film frames it as accurate. Not that anyone actually bothered to ask the butcher for his pronouns, though. At this point, we've spent a while getting to appreciate Nyla as a character, so her assertive feminism is less show-stoppingly annoying and more of a personal trait that sometimes annoys other characters. She is now respected and allowed to influence the plot framing as an outspoken feminist. It's a tricky balancing act that Landon pulls off with flying colors. Millie, Nyla, and Booker go to get Ladola from the police station, while Josh babysits the butcher. When his back is turned, the butcher works out his bonds. And then Josh's mom comes home early. The butcher immediately plays the victim to manipulate her into releasing him. Josh? Well, at least he doesn't pretend they're rehearsing a school play.
What? No, we're rehearsing a skit.
Yeah, the torture scene from Arsenic and Old Lace.
Mm-hmm. Yep, there's a torture scene. Want more info? Buy tickets.
He instead goes for BDSM roleplay. Original.
Naughty girl.
I think you're just a big bully, picking on people smaller than you are.
Now I will kill you.
Aside from being hilarious, this bit progressively subverts one of the biggest transphobic and misogynistic tropes in the transgender predicament genre: sexual humiliation. Most transgender predicament fiction plays up a fetish element for humor and titillation, where there's this focus on the man being degraded by having his manliness stripped away. Whereas, Freaky shows the butcher embrace femininity, only caring about his effective ability to kill people, has the backstory about Millie's dad getting over his initial repulsion to wearing pink, and then mocks the very concept of sexual humiliation. The butcher is not rendered impotent in his bondage. He is still an active threat. When Josh tries to sexually humiliate him, it's silly and ineffective. Instead of the framing leading the audience to laugh at the butcher as a disempowered man, the humor derives from Josh playing with fire by provoking him, and the absurdity of him pretending to be attracted to girls.
I'm straight.
This slides close to the biphobia of Scream Queens. Fortunately, Landon is better at this than Ryan Murphy. It's less about the supposed absurdity of a gay person being interested in another gender, as it is the absurdity of Josh being interested in girls. It ends up a progressive normalization of gayness, and also funny. Josh's mom doesn't buy it, and goes to free the butcher, just as he gets free himself. Somehow, him chasing them around the room with a knife is hilarious. They end up recreating the "Here's Johnny" scene from The Shining, except that the butcher's girl body is too weak for him to break in, and then switches targets. At the police station, they note that Shar is the only cop working that night, and Nyla goes in on her own. She tells Shar that she and Josh were kidnapped, but she got away, and that the butcher is right outside, getting her to leave so that she can retrieve Ladola. Booker and Millie bond while waiting in the car. Millie confesses that as much as she doesn't like being in that body, she likes the utility of it as a strong, badass monster that she can use to live out a power fantasy. Booker tells her that true strength is in the mind and heart. Far from it being a useless platitude, the film goes a long way to proving it true, with the butcher figuring out how to wield her body as an effective weapon, succeeding in being absolutely terrifying, even with what Millie was given. She just needs to figure out how to use it herself. Booker moves to the back seat with her, and the two of them get romantic, despite Millie looking like that. He can see the girl within, lending complete legitimacy to the concept of personality mattering more than the body. There is a large element of humor in this portrayal, with Vince Vaughn's girlish movements slow and deliberate to draw out the strangeness of the moment. And the two of them making out is fundamentally a joke. Even so, the humor derives from the actors playing it straight, and within the joke, it's a respectful framing of the romance. I am a bit forgiving of cishet media that laughs at queerness, provided it isn't based on queerphobia. We're not laughing at the fear of a gay sexual harasser, like the guy on the train in Eurotrip, or a guy just being repulsed by the thought that a guy might be into him, like with most donut jokes in Red vs. Blue.
Oh, buddy, it looks like this is the end for us. Since we're gonna die anyway, there's only one thing left for us to do. Griff, if you actually suggest what I think you're about to suggest, I'll just have to kill myself.
We're laughing at the weirdness of the situation, but still respect Booker and Millie as characters. While it's not ideal, and probably will look dated in about 10 years, deriving this kind of humor from queer sexuality is still a positive association, unlike the repulsion we're supposed to feel from the male leads kissing in Death Trap. Yeah, I'll sign off on it. Millie breaks off the kiss, saying that she doesn't feel comfortable being romantic while in that body. You know, she needs to transition first to get past that gender dysphoria. While Booker is a good cis ally willing to respect her needs. Yep. Shar comes back in just in time to see Nyla take Ladola from the locker. Suspicious, she immediately pulls a gun on her and treats the situation like Nyla is directly threatening her with it as a knife, and not just holding an archaeological artifact in an evidence bag. It honestly makes no sense. Oh, wait, Shar is a cop? Nyla is a black girl? Yeah, it actually does make sense.
Fuck off, piggies.
This tense altercation keeps Josh from warning her about the butcher, and he runs in and takes Ladola as Millie runs after him. Shar turns her attention on Millie and forces her into a cell as the butcher runs away. Booker comes in, and Millie takes advantage of the distraction to take Char's gun away and lock her in the cell. They leave the station, meet Josh, and head to the old mill for the homecoming dance, in the hopes of catching the butcher there. He does go, and he locates the jock who groped him for a little revenge. The jock leads him off down a dark corridor, where his two buddies lie in wait so that they can gang rape Millie. Possibly a reference to I Spit on Your Grave? The butcher is momentarily stunned at this level of hostility, misogyny, and his own vulnerability as a teen girl facing 3 rapists. Assessing the situation, he does what he needs to do in order to get the upper hand. He pretends to submit to the inevitability of being raped, asks for one guy's whiskey bottle, and then he has a weapon. He uses it to bludgeon one guy so hard the bottle breaks, stabs another with its shards, and as for the main jock, he grabs a randomly placed nearby chainsaw and does his best Leatherface impression. In Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, Leatherface is sent to kill Stretch, the female protagonist who knows too much, but his chainsaw jams just when he corners her. Utilizing her sexuality, the only tool a woman is supposed to have over a man, she seduces him, and he symbolically has sex with her, using the chainsaw as a stand-in phallus, in one of the most overt uses of the phallic weapon trope. After pretending to orgasm, he then spares her. By the end of the film, she gets her own chainsaw and defeats Leatherface's eviler brother, symbolically acquiring masculine power, as is a final girl trope.
It's deeply symbolic. She's empowering herself with cock.
The butcher is both a male slasher villain and a final girl. He utilizes phallic weapons in his capacity as the male villain, and must reclaim it when men threaten him with rape. He isn't a girl, but he kind of stands up on behalf of girls too. He takes the phallic chainsaw and symbolically rapes the jock who would have raped him, like Leatherface to Stretch. This time, with the chainsaw actually moving.
He had to split.
The good guys arrive at the old mill, with only a few minutes left until midnight, and the switch is permanent. Booker gives Millie his watch with a timer set, and they split up. Josh asks a jock if he's seen Millie, and he says that he has, which we saw that he did. The butcher did walk past him at one point. But then he leads Josh into a dark corridor with this teasing, sexually dominant attitude. And this coming directly after the attempted rape of the butcher, tension is high. Well, he's not that big of a jackass. He forcibly kisses him, which is still sexual assault, but it isn't attempted gang rape either. It feels like a narrative punishment for Josh saying something rapey at the beginning of the movie. Now he knows what it feels like. While perhaps an ill-advised writing decision, it's not the cringiest use of sexual assault as punishment. Like with Coming to Respect Nyla, we've traveled with Josh and are repulsed by the forced kiss on his side as he expresses his distaste. The jock, insecure with his own sexuality, calls him a slur, backs against a particularly thin old mill wall, and then the butcher kills him from the other side before cutting his way through the wall. You behave in a rapey fashion in this movie, you do something homophobic, you're gonna get punished. It's not perfectly feminist, but the statement it makes is striking. Josh summons Millie, who tells Josh to go to safety. She can handle it.
I want my body back.
Come and get it.
I am fascinated by how much the butcher just doesn't seem to want to switch back. Even Vampire Willow was eventually willing to help the Scoobies to go back home. The butcher cares more about hurting Millie than switching back, because some people are dicks, potentially gender-fluid dicks. The cops arrive at the dance during their altercation. Stop shooting like that! Finally taking the initiative to help, Booker runs interference, while Nyla and Josh help Millie overpower the butcher and ready Ladola for the switch back. As a final girl in a man's body, Millie also reclaims the phallus with Ladola.
She'll reach for something phallic on purpose.
My weapon.
Booker sets his watch 5 minutes fast, so they briefly think that they've run out of time, and the butcher just laughs hysterically. He's gender fluid, I swear. Well, Millie remembers the watch runs fast, and stabs him just as the cops get past Booker and arrive on the scene. After some quick questioning, Nyla and Josh confirm that Millie is in the right body.
Shoot that motherfucker!
The butcher falls to the ground, and, like all slasher movie villains, is definitely 100% dead. Ladola gets collected by the cops for a sequel hook. Booker and Millie finally have their romantic kiss, back in the right body. Shara apparently has no ill feelings toward Nyla. Millie and Coral are finally on the right path after Coral's talk with a random customer. Josh somehow smooths things over with his mom. I'm guessing he says something like, "Wow, Millie sure got into that sex game, am I right? Well, this is why you need to call first when you come home early. Also, I'm not straight. Bye." Hey, did Char leave the door open? That's weird. The butcher holds a knife to Millie's throat. They've returned to their traditional roles and once again face each other as slasher villain and slasher victim. However, they're both different people having walked in each other's shoes. And, for what might be the first time in his life, he cares about her, another person, in the same way that he cares about himself. He wants her to succeed now, to learn the lessons that he himself learned to become powerful in her body. And in his twisted way, he amazingly shows nurturing behavior. It's implied that he wants to whisk her off into the darkness to torture her into becoming another butcher. As someone whose role Millie took on for a power fantasy, she is effectively threatened by her shadow self. He is who she could be if she abandoned all empathy. And that is exactly what he threatens her with. Char and Coral attack, and in this struggle, Millie tries to kill him in a stereotypical slasher villain way, knife above her head, which he likes and encourages. She hesitates, and then he strikes and hurts her, but ultimately wants to nurture that aggressive potential.
I am defenseless. Take your weapon. Strike me down with all of your hatred, and your journey towards the dark side will be complete.
Faced with the possibility of her family dying, Millie finds the strength of mind and heart to then take the basic lesson from the butcher, while retaining her purity of spirit and join her sister and mother to fight back.
I learned something when I was in your body, too.
What's that?
Having balls sucks.
I think most trans women would agree. Ultimately, she kills the butcher with a piece of wood in an allusion to the Buffy the Vampire Slayer movie, ultimately reclaiming the phallus as the final girl.
She'll be taking my manhood and empowering herself with it.
Char and Coral stare in wonder.
I am a fucking piece.
Roll credits. Suck My Cherry by Haiku Hands plays an homage to this display of female dominance. Millie has achieved full victory over her pushover character flaw and stands up to the world's biggest bully while still caring about others and acting in their interest as well as her own. And hi, trans pride flag! Fancy seeing your colors happening to show up exactly in order. And so concludes Freaky. So yeah, that was one of the most trans-positive films I've ever seen. Right up there with The Matrix and Bit. I'm willing to assert that Christopher Landon is a solid cis-gay ally of the trans community. Unless he ever indicates he identifies otherwise. Transphobia is so tied into homophobia and misogyny that by virtue of focusing on elevating the transgender predicament genre, it necessarily becomes queer-friendly and feminist. To an extent, the movie resembles the awful film The Hot Chick, but is actually good. Gender identities are respected, and so are the genders. The gender line and its transgressions are framed respectfully, showing the capacity for both empowerment and disempowerment, lending respect to different gender performances. Removing the element of sexual humiliation, and even mocking it as a concept, goes a long way to frame both leads with respect. At the same time, there is still an active element of sex appeal, just specifically making it about a dominant, possibly gender-fluid, trans mask showing confidence and not being afraid to flirt with everyone. There is a general lack of slut-shaming. The students spread a few mean rumors, and the teacher is a jerk about the butcher flirting with Booker, but the framing doesn't support them. Sex is sexy, consent is sexy, rape and bullying will get you murdered. When dealing with an issue as nuanced as gender, it's hard to avoid problematic implications. And Freaky isn't perfect. Without making any firm assertions that the butcher is gender fluid, his easy adoption of the feminine aesthetic problematically negates the character's masculinity. Blue Pajamas with Wiener Dogs only goes so far when he dives into the Terminatrix look and abandons masculine signifiers. The fact that he is a man, tries to steal a girl's body and act as a wolf in sheep's clothing, also resembles transphobic radical feminists, fears of trans women being pervy men disguising themselves as women to prey on girls where they're vulnerable, like the Butcher does with Ryler. Given the transgender flag illusion, I am certain that this was unintentional, but it is a problematic implication that could resonate in the current political climate. One big flaw is that it doesn't handle race well. With Josh's "You're black! I'm gay! We are so dead!" the film asserts an awareness of racism in the horror genre, and seemingly tries to do better. Nyla is central enough to the plot that she avoids minor character and horror movie syndrome, but blackness isn't celebrated nearly to the extent that queerness is. There's that black wiener joke. If Char's suspicion of Nyla is supposed to criticize police racism, it's not nearly explicit enough. And no matter how much the rich people are depicted as douchey for buying all those native artifacts, Ladola is derivative of racist fears of natives as Satan worshippers, the kind of thing that justified genocide. Overall, though, I am ecstatic over this movie. It's strange to encounter feminist content to this degree in either a slasher film or a transgender predicament film. It's honestly bizarre, but that's testament to the writing talent. It's an excellently done film, extremely self-contained with few dangling plot threads, and a fun ride from beginning to end. Please like, share, subscribe, and consider donating to my Patreon. Pledges of $2 or more will earn you an explicit thank you at the end of each video. Thank you.